We acknowledge that this event is taking place upon the traditional territories, the territories of the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy, the Anishinaabe peoples of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and before them the Chinantan Nation, called the Neutral by the French, and the Attawandaron by the surrounding nations. These people are the original caretakers, the peoples that lived on and intimately worked with these lands. We acknowledge that we have a responsibility to know and understand their heritage. The treaty that was signed for this territory is the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 of 1792, and further the deed referred to as the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, which applies to the land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from the mouth to its source. We need to be aware of our role in these documents. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples upon this land. We acknowledge that we have an obligation to learn to live wisely together on this land.
Thanks for having me here tonight to talk about something that I find fascinating. And a special thanks to Nathan, although he's not here, because Nathan was kind enough to let me actually handle the example that they have in the museum here. And that example, for anyone that doesn't know, actually came and is attributed to the Joseph Brant family. So there's a lot of history, not only in that particular pipe tomahawk, but the family itself and Brantford. These pipe hawks, or this style, they're known as the Regency era, or the War of 1812 style pipe tomahawk, because the numbers that were produced peaked as a result of the war. So they're probably one of the most common styled pipe tomahawks, British pipe tomahawks you'll find in British North America. Tomahawks and guns were a part of everyday life. Tomahawks were used for smoking, protection, daily chores, and as a weapon. Tomahawks are known to be both a symbol of peace and war. And in this piece of artwork, 1807, we can see a couple examples of both. The two gentlemen, we can see are either holding or leaning on their gun. The gentleman closest to us is actually smoking a clay pipe. And of course he's staring at another fellow that's kind of relaxing under the tree, smoking an actual pipe tomahawk, and his musket is leaning up against that tree. In the background we can see a young woman. She has a baby in her cradle board on her back, and it's suspended by a tough line on her forehead. And another woman in the background, of course, is tending a pot over a kettle. And we can also see looks like a couple geese and some fish hanging out. So they were a part of everyday life. Again, useful items. Of course, they were used for more than one thing, as we'll get into. Guns were used as well for harvesting food, protection, to supplement your income if you were involved in the fur trade or supplying a local fort with food, geese, deer meat, and so on. Excuse me. And of course, as a weapon during war. Often, in times of war, a war belt was made and constructed of wampum beads. And in that belt, they often worked in the pattern of a tomahawk. And they would paint it red with red ochre. And that belt would be sent to the different local nations, trying to get their support, in this case for the British, for any upcoming war or disagreement. If the belt was accepted, and in the indigenous culture you didn't have to, there was no obligation to take part in anybody else's squabbles or problems or wars. So if it wasn't accepted, that's fine. They went on to the next nation. But if it was, you could definitely count on their support. And we can see this warrior now. They've gone from relaxing after their hunting excursion. This gentleman is all decked out for war. He's got his musket in his hand. We can see his pipe tomahawk is tucked inside his sash. He has a powder horn sitting on his hip, and he has his knife suspended around his neck. And he's painted, so he's ready. Obviously, he's ready for war. He's just sneaking out from behind the trees. And it's interesting to note that it wasn't just the indigenous warriors that would carry a tomahawk during battle. What we would refer to as the frontier, the civilian militias, learned the mode of fighting that the indigenous people did, which was what we call guerrilla fighting now, bush fighting if you want to call it. So oftentimes the civilian militia would also carry a tomahawk because it was the handiest hand-to-hand tool or weapon to have with you. So it wasn't, it was soon adopted by the different European folks as well. Now, see that there. Now, Isaac Well was a fellow that traveled North America. We have all these wonderful narratives from different people that came from Europe to see what North America was like and what the indigenous people were like and so on and so forth. And Isaac Well, while he was at Amherstburg, he makes a note. He mentions the favorite pastime of smoking and how the pipe hawk was the favorite thing to smoke out of, and it served the purpose of both a tool and a pipe. And Well tells us that the common tomahawk is nothing more than a light hatchet, but the most approved sort has on the back of the hatchet and connected in one piece the bowl of a pipe. So when the handle is perforated, the tomahawk answers every purpose of a pipe. The Indians indeed are fonder of smoking out of a tomahawk than out of any other sort. And if I had to guess from this same picture, that fella standing in the center using his little clay pipe, he seems to be looking at the fella using his pipe tomahawk and thinking, "God, I wish I had one of those." But it was a favorite pastime, not only amongst the indigenous people, but the Europeans soon caught on to that great thing of smoking, and it's still with us today.
Tobacco?
Tobacco.
Like regular tobacco.
Exactly. Well, the tobacco that they grew back then is nothing like the tobacco that we have now. That stuff would have been so full of nicotine, and didn't have the other chemicals that they use now to keep it fresh and preserved. But that stuff would it's like the real coffee. It just knocks you right on your butt if you're not careful. But and again, no one knows when the first pipe tomahawk appeared. It was definitely a European, I wouldn't call it an invention, but an idea. From the time of contact, the Europeans certainly learned about the indigenous peoples and their customs, and of course this idea of smoking tobacco, between trading and learning to grow different crops and surviving, the Europeans thought, well, if we can combine a tomahawk, because now we're trading, they're putting their stone tools away and using all these new metal tools and weapons that we're bringing with us. If we combine a pipe with a tomahawk, it'd be like the Swiss Army knife. And it definitely caught on. And by 1812, by the time of the War of 1812, the British tomahawk had refined itself to exactly what the First Nations or the indigenous people wanted. It became fairly large, heavy duty, useful as a weapon, useful as a tool, very useful for smoking. So by 1812, that's again probably the most common style that we see is from that era. Now, let's move on here. Now, again, we talked about its purposes for smoking and so on. We understand that, and a little bit about it being used as a weapon. It's like anything that you use every day. Either you get really good at using it or you don't. Well, as a weapon, they became very good at using a tomahawk during war, mainly for throwing. They would shoot, of course, we use their weapons, the guns first. When it got down to seeing the enemy retreating, then they would chase after them and use their tomahawks. And Dr. William Tiger Dunlop, and he served on the Niagara front, he recalled during his recollections of the war that he saw the aftermath of the indigenous people chasing the enemy. He said he described them as seeing, he never saw them throw it, but he could see that they didn't miss too often by the number of cleft skulls that they found in the woods. So when he came back, he asked this chief that he was friends with to just show him, can you demonstrate for me? And he tells us, I afterwards requested the chief to show how he threw the tomahawk. He accordingly cut a small chip out of the bark of a tree, and standing some 14 yards off, and taking his tomahawk with its pole to the front, he threw it, and it was buried some inches excuse me, into the oak, with the handle upmost, it having turned in its flight. So when he says the pole, he means the back part of it, the pipe bowl. So he had the blade facing behind him when he threw it. And he threw it in such a way that when it hit the person in the head, the inertia, and that's another reason why they preferred the hawk head to be that big and heavy, because the force in throwing it was sure to be, the impact would kill the person or whoever they were throwing it at, or whatever they were throwing at. Now, when he says 14 yards, well, for us folks that aren't up on our metric, 14 yards, it's just over 40 feet. So can you imagine throwing something, from here, this room probably isn't quite 40 feet long, so throwing something that far in the bush and be that accurate, that says a lot about, and he did it time and time again to prove it. It wasn't just he wasn't just a one-hit wonder. But it just amazes me. If I was in that position, if I was being chased by a fellow with a tomahawk, I'd want to make sure that I was really, really fast, or I was at least 40 feet ahead of it all times. Otherwise, it wasn't probably going to end too well for me. So that brings us to who made them for the British, and who made them, period. Well, again, as I mentioned, by 1812, they had developed into an indigenous preferred size and pattern. They were produced by both English and North American manufacturers, local blacksmiths, military-based armorers at North American military forts, and they were so well sought by the indigenous people that they were copied by the American smiths as well, because the indigenous folks traveled. They didn't think much of borders. They traveled freely back and forth all the time. Now, military armors, for those that don't know, those are like the blacksmiths for the army. So those fellas, they not only could they fix different things, fix guns, fix anything that broke, but they could make guns. They could make the tomahawks. So they, as well, made the tomahawks for anything that the indigenous people wanted or repaired. They would repair the guns as well. And some of the better known English makers during the War of 1812 was a fellow by the name of William Parks. Now, William Parks, he was known to have supplied items for the Hudson Bay Company, edged weapons, axes, tomahawks, all sorts, anything they needed, chisels, ice chisels, anything of metal. Another company, Parks and Company, that's one and the same. Zach Parks, now we know that he was a nephew or a relative of William, and I would speculate that he probably apprenticed under that William. And there's another gentleman by the name of Jacob Holtzaffel, and I'm probably pronouncing that name incorrectly, but those darn English guys, in archaic English, the what looks like a lowercase f is actually what they called a high S or a low S. So it's actually made an S sound. But to read it, you want to keep going, but it's not. So I'm not sure if that's just the spelling of the time. So if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, I apologize. There's another manufacturer, very well known. His hawks are very well known. He stamped his with the initials B and E with the silhouette of a bird in between. But we don't know who it is exactly. We haven't been able to identify him. The hawks that he made, and actually he made the one that's in the collection here. I would hazard a guess that the ones that he made with the imagery that's on them, and we'll talk about the imagery in a few minutes, I would guess that they were probably given to the chiefs and principal men of any of the different nations, because they are a little nicer tomahawk as far as the imagery goes on them than just the regular ones. Now, these manufacturers of the tomahawks, they just didn't make their living by making tomahawks for the indigenous people, for the British military. These fellows already had existing manufacturing businesses in Birmingham. Birmingham was a large industrial center in England at the time. That's where all the manufacturing was done, including weapons both for the indigenous people and for the British military. So how these guys got to make these weapons for the indigenous people, well, contracts were put out by a branch of the British military known as the Board of Ordnance. And the Board of Ordnance was a branch that would put out contracts for weapons that the military requested. And they had to be made to certain specs, and they had to be made to a certain quality. So if you didn't pry something up to muster, you wouldn't get a contract from them. So they would stamp anything that they had made with their brand. So you'll see again in a couple slides, you'll see some of these pipe tomahawks that have got the brand of the Board of Ordnance on it, which consisted of the capital B and the capital O with an arrowhead in between, often referred to as a broad arrow. The English like to call it the broad arrow. And that assured that they met the military specs, and they of a quality that they would be deemed dependable. They wouldn't break and so on. So once they had all these tomahawks, and they made quite a few of them, they had to get them over, of course, to Canada. And so, of course, they shipped them over, and they would land in Lower Canada at Quebec or Montreal. And from there, they would be distributed by another branch of the British military, actually a civilian branch, known as the British Indian Department. And again, these fellas were made up of former fur traders, fellows former soldiers that had spent time like butlers, rangers out in the bush and around a lot of indigenous people, knew their customs. Many had married indigenous women and had families with them. So they knew the customs, they knew what they wanted, they knew how to the proper diplomacy when dealing or counseling with the indigenous people. So they acted as go-betweens as well between the British military and the indigenous peoples when it came to times of discussing war and ceding land and so on and so forth. There was quite, it's sad, I don't want to get too far off topic, but there was a time when, especially during the War of 1812, when the indigenous nations were considered and thought of as sovereign nations, and they were treated as such. The indigenous peoples had ceremonies that they insisted take place because it was their custom to do it, and the British happily did that. And often, you see in the old archives and records, they were considered a sovereign nation, and it wasn't too long afterwards that they were thought of just wards of the nation. But anyway, so they would get these goods into Canada, and they would stop at Montreal and unload and distribute whatever was needed for those nations, indigenous nations in Lower Canada, the Algonquin, the Abenaki, the Mi'kmaq, and the Hurons at Lorette, and so on. Then they would be shipped up, further to Lachine and Kingston, and from Kingston they would remove whatever they needed for the different nations, Saint-Domingue and in those areas there, on down to Fort York, Fort George, where again they would be distributed to the Six Nations here, and the Mississauga, and whatever, the Chippewa, and whatever nations were here. They would then go up onward up to Amherstburg, to Fort Malden's, where the same thing would be repeated. So we're talking handling of thousands of items, from tomahawks to blankets to guns and everything else. From Amherstburg, they would finally make their way up to the lakehead to Fort St. Joseph's, at St. Joseph's Island, and then after that Drummond Island, after they closed Fort St. Joseph's, and during the war Fort Michilimackinac. Now some of those nations in the Upper Lakes, they were coming from the lakehead of Lake Superior, and lower parts of what we would call Manitoba, now in the Dakotas. So the same pipe tomahawk that you saw a Mi'kmaq person using on the East Coast is the very same example of the one being used in the Red River areas. So they quite a geographical area that these things traveled. Now we see in these examples, this is from the Grey Roots and from the British Museum, but we see tomahawk made by Parks, and we see his name stamped on it, and the Board of Ordnance stamp with the B and the O and the broad arrow, and of course an example of Mr. Holtzapfel's pipe hawks, and they were a nice, item. These can be found in collections not only in North America but in Europe as well. And you'll note that the stamping is all on the same side of the blade. If you look back at the Brant hawk and the one that I have on display, the stamping is all on what they call the left side proper. And that's not only does that mean it's the left side of the blade, but when you're holding that tomahawk in your hand, and people were right-handed back then, and if you weren't, you were made right-handed. When you held that tomahawk in your right hand with the blade pointing away from you, you saw all the stamping on that with your right eye. It was all visible. That was just something the government insisted be done. I don't know if it was a marketing ploy or what it was, but it was done on knives, even your kitchen cutlery. The names, everything was stamped on what they refer to as the left side proper. Now I talked about they wanted or they preferred a certain style and size, and this is an example of the head, and we can see that they were quite big, anywhere from 8 to 9 3/4 long from the tip of the blade to the tip of the pipe bowl, fairly flat across the top. The pipe bowl slightly smaller in proportion to the rest of the blade. The blade itself anywhere from 3 to 3 1/4 inches sweeping down and back. It's hard to know for sure what the original spec was, because any examples we have were sharpened more than once, so we don't know how much they got worn down. On the underside of the blade there's a little wee cleft, or a little beard as I call it, and it was always just forward of the eye, and the eye of the tomahawk head is where the handle went through. It was always teardrop shaped, and the walls on either side of the head itself were quite thick and robust. The same with the pipe bowl, very thick walls, and that's because if you're throwing them 40 feet, you don't want them to break. So they were heavy, and again, with that extra weight, they could do some cutting, some real damage. The hafts or the handles on them, they were anywhere from 20 inches up to 24 inches long. 22 is pretty common. I think the Brant hawk, and I've got his specs right in my book here, I think it's 22, and the one that I made is just slightly longer. Chief Tecumseh received one at Fort Malden, and it had a 26-inch handle on it. So they were like I'd almost call it a half axe almost. You know, they're not like a great big chopping axe, but man, they were quite robust in their manufacture. It's funny. The head itself, these guys were we think we're smart now, but we're not. We're smart because the people before us were smarter, you know. They made that head out of wrought iron, and wrought iron was a little cheaper metal that they could use. But to have a quality blade during the manufacturing process, they would hammer weld in a much better piece of steel for the blade, so that it would sharpen easy and hold an edge better. So they could cut costs by using a cheaper metal for the body, but they used a really good piece of hardened steel for the cutting blade. And if you look, I'm not sure if the Brant hawk has it, there's a chip out, and you can see where the layers changed between that hardened steel and the wrought iron. So they were pretty clever fellows. And in the photo to the right of it, this is the imagery that I was talking about earlier that we see on the pipe hawks made by B&E. And some people feel those are Masonic Lodge emblems. They're symbolic of the Masonic Lodge, because masonry was a big a big thing back then. I think Joseph Brant was a Mason. A few other, one of his sons, his son-in-law, Robert Keir, was a Mason. And that may very well be. I've never found anything to say yes or no, but I do know that to a lot of indigenous cultures, they connect to and relate to the sun, the moon, and the stars. They often refer to the sun as grandfather sun, and the moon is grandmother moon. That's some of their creation stories involve those two elements. The cluster of 7 stars was 6 points. Again, to many First Nations cultures, the sky people up in the stars, that's where they originally come from. They come down from heaven to earth. We came from the stars, and we'll go back to the stars. Some feel that the 7 stars may be indicative of the constellations, like the 7 points of the Big Dipper. So whether it was by coincidence or on purpose, whatever those symbols were, they meant something possibly to both cultures, both the European culture and the indigenous culture. But again, I would speculate just from what the ones that I've seen, they were probably given to chiefs and principal men, and that's probably why Brant got one and not just a plain one with the park stamped on it and the Board of Ordnance stamp on it. And here we see the stamp of Zach Parks, and these guys, this is in the ROM, and I asked them if the example they had the Board of Ordnance stamp on it, and I emailed them, and I know a few of the curators there, so they're used to getting my mail. What's he want now? I said, "Have you got any more images?" And he said, "Well, yeah, there's an image of the manufacturer on there, Zach Arks," and that's how he spelled it. He said you can just barely make out the A, and of course I had already done my research anyway on the family. I said, you did a great job, but that should actually read Parks. I said, I'm sure when the guy was stamping it, after stamping 100 a day, he wasn't hitting it as hard as he maybe would have went at 7 in the morning as he did at 4 at night. But that's actually Zach Parks. And of course they want to know first, have you got any documentation? So, sent. And yep, he said, Zach, who goes by Zach? I said, well, it was actually Zachariah. And he went by Zach, and I sent him some images of documents where he signed his name Zach at all times. So it's one of the same guys. So they amended their notation on their site. And of course, again, the stamp of B&E. Now this fella, the thing about it is we know these three, the other ones were definitely English manufacturers because they had the Board of Ordnance stamp on it. The Hawks with the B&E that they made don't have the Board of Ordnance stamp on it. So that leads me to believe that they either weren't made in England, they could have made somewhere else in Europe, or they could have been made in North America. But regardless, they would have had to have been made under the authority and license of the British Ordnance Department because they're dead on. And I've got examples from Grey Roots. I got them all in my book. Nathan helped me with my little calipers do the measuring, and they're spot on. So they were made to the specs of the Board of Ordnance. Only their imagery was added as opposed to the Board of Ordnance stamp. So there's some mystery there that I haven't solved yet, and I hope I live long enough to figure it out.
Can you remind people where the McCord Museum is?
McCord Museum is located in Montreal. Okay. And it's interesting, a lot of their indigenous items were collected by a fella years ago, originally from Six Nations. And he worked big, he was a Mohawk, and he became a doctor, member of the Oddfellows Hall, the Foresters I should say, and collected all these items and had a big museum down near Kingston. The Oddfellows went into hit hard times, and that collection was divided between the ROM, Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and the McCord Museum in Montreal. So a lot of his items you'll see were split between the two, and we're very thankful that they weren't just sold off to collectors. we'd never see half of this stuff. Now, as I mentioned, the pipe tomahawks were made and shipped to North America by the hundreds and as many as 1,000 at one time. We can see in this photo from the Grey Roots Museum at Owen Sound that we have 4 original examples. 3 are pretty well original, including the handles on them. The one at the bottom, we can see it's had a very hard life. It's been hafted at one time. It's got a more modern, short, stocky handle on it. And at one time it's been used as a hammer as they were, and the pipe bowl's been broken off. And if you look at the size of the blade, that blade has been sharpened so many times and reworked so many times. When you compare it to how it originally would have looked, man, it could tell some stories. And in the photo to the right, this is a partial list of a list of goods, presents they used to call it, going to the destined for the indigenous peoples. And under tomahawks, we can see 1,000 tomahawks being shipped to go over to Canada to be distributed between Lower Canada and Upper Canada. So those lists, these presents, when I call them presents, at the time of contact, it was a habit to give presents to form good relations with the indigenous peoples. And that policy just continued and continued. And when the British when Wolfe beat Montcalm and the British took over New France, they continued that policy of continuing to give them, the indigenous peoples, these presents once a year, because they knew they were going to need the land, and they knew if there was ever going to be another war, that it'd be better to have as many indigenous folks backing you up, supplementing your army, as the other guy's army. So they would receive these gifts every year. Now, after the War of 1812, the threat of war with the Americans or anybody else, the Spanish and so on, it became less and less and less. So the British, of course, in their wisdom thought, now we should start cutting down these presents. We got to do something. Like, we can't just keep doing all this stuff all the time and so on. So the presents, the amount they got became less and less, and by 1850 they completely did away with the idea of giving presents. But in this is from an 1830 tool catalog from the manufacturer was Sheffield, and of course based out of Birmingham. You can still see in 1830 that they're still manufacturing and had available pipe tomahawks and the teardrop-shaped tapered handle drilled to go along with them. But again, by 1850, that was a thing of the past. Now, when they started treating with the Plains nations, they also used tomahawks, but not near as many and not of this style, because the Plains people had their own idea of what a tomahawk should be. So the British primarily just dealt in goods, guns and goods, not really, axes and so on and so forth, but not the tomahawk like we think of during the War of 1812. And lastly, on the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812, the Canadian government came out with a banner to honor all those forces that had taken part in helping to secure Canada for the British. And we can see by the banner that the background carries the colors of the Canadian flag, the red, white, and red. The crown, of course, represents the government. The cross swords are representative of the land forces, the army and the civilian militias. The anchor, of course, represents the Navy and the provincial Marines that took part on the Great Lakes and so on. And the pipe tomahawks, one on either side, represent the indigenous nations. And there was as many, if I recall correctly, as many as 24 different nations that supported the British during the War of 1812. And if you ask most people, they think of probably 2. They would automatically think Mohawks, they think of John Norton, and they think of Tecumseh the Shawnee. They have no clue that so many other different nations, as far as the Illinois to the Missouri River, many of those nations came and supported the British from the west, traveled 1,000 miles just to come and fight here at Queenston and at Detroit and Chrysler's Farm. Anyway, that takes care of the Tomahawks. How am I doing for time? Good, I guess.
Speed up a little bit. Speed up just a little.
Again, the firearms that were being distributed to the indigenous people, they weren't new to them, okay? They had been being traded firearms almost at the point of contact. So the indigenous people had used firearms for over 100 years that had been supplied by the Europeans. But again, by 1812, through the government and through the fur traders, there was a gun that they preferred. And it was known by different names. And of course, they became experts in using it. And Sir George Head, in 1815, while he's up in the Barrie area of Kempenfelt Bay, he makes note of just how good a shot they were of the gun. And he tells us that when they were hunting geese, actually, geese and loons, the Indians shoot them frequently, which is very surprising considering their guns are of course Birmingham manufactured and their powder very indifferent. They kill nevertheless at extremely long shots, putting in a large quantity of powder and very low shot. So he calls it a Birmingham gun, and he says they're good shots considering the cheap gun they got and the cheap powder that they have. Because when he says the powder is indifferent, it wasn't always good. It'd be good and bad, whatever they happen to have. So that's just that's a very, very telling little. He doesn't realize how much information he gave us. These guns, they're known by different names, by different people. The fur traders referred to them as Northwest trade guns. British civilians and fellows like Sir George Head, he called them a Birmingham gun because that's where they were manufactured. The British military called them a common gun because it was just a cheap common gun. But the military didn't only supply the common gun, but they supplied another gun, again presented to chiefs and principal men, called interestingly enough, a chief's gun. And they were almost the same gun, but just fancier, quite a bit fancier, and I'll show you that in a second. Now these guns were lighter in weight than their military counterparts because they were moving through the bush and they didn't need a great big long cumbersome thing and so on. So they were lighter, and common barrel length is 42 inches. You could get them in different barrel sizes, but generally a 20 gauge was common size, and they were also available in a rifled barrel. And when I mean 20 gauge, that's how they determined the size of the shot, what to call this gun. What they did was they had a barrel that was so big, and they had a lead ball that would fit it. So they thought, how do we figure, what do we call this thing? So, the guy thought, well, you know what? Why don't we see how many of the balls that fit this gun will add up to a pound? And then that's what we'll call that barrel. So sure enough, if you can't figure it out, 20 lead balls ended up weighing a pound, so they called that barrel size a 20 gauge. Which is helpful because when the guy went to buy his lead shot for that gun, if you asked for a pound, he would know he better have 20 balls there, or even 21 if he was lucky. If he had anything less, somebody's scales are a little out. So it was actually a fairly simple but ingenious way of figuring that out. When I say a rifled barrel, these muskets, if you get a chance to take a look at them, the barrels are smooth on the inside. They're just a smooth bore like a modern shotgun. A rifled barrel, if you look down the inside of the rifled barrel, they would actually have grooves machined into that barrel, a real long curve from the tip of the barrel to the bottom of the barrel. And what that did was it really made a difference in the accuracy of the weapon. So what you couldn't shoot with your smooth bore because the ball just went all over the place, the idea was you had a lot better chance of hitting it with a rifled gun. That's why those fellows in the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War, if you ever saw them, they stand in a row, great big long row, and point at the other guy in hopes that somebody gets hit, right? And that's their idea. Just throw a whole bunch of lead and you've got to hit something sooner or later. Whereas the rifle barrel, you're more accurate from a lot longer distance. Did take longer to load, but they were available and the indigenous people did use them. Now you can see by the numbers that were produced, almost 27,000 firearms in 3 years came over to the indigenous, for use by the indigenous people. And they were made by any one of those manufacturers. And some of those manufacturers were also manufacturing for the fur trade companies, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company. So you see, like Ketland and Walker, they made almost 3,000 weapons, and John Gill produced 943. So some produced a lot. Those guys that were producing a lot, they were already in the habit of making them for the different fur trade companies. And as it says at the bottom, that of this grand total of 26,786 weapons, only 2,636 were pistols. The others were common guns, chief guns, or rifles. Amongst the pistols, 531 were delivered in 1813, 1,319 were delivered in 1814, and 786 were delivered in 1815. The indigenous people didn't have much use for a pistol. Tecumseh had a brace of pistols, right? And the big story with that is just before the Battle of the Thames, the night before the battle, he sat down with Proctor and the rest of his bigwigs there to talk about the battle, and he took his brace of pistols, slammed them on the table on either side of his plate, and said that you more or less said, "You guys are as useful as these things are to me." But Shanny wasn't too far wrong, unfortunately. But
Question.
Yep.
Do you know what percentage of the rifles, of the guns would have had rifling done to them?
Oh, if I had to guess, I would guess maybe 15% were rifled.
Okay, right.
They're just too expensive.
Well, it's costly to do.
Absolutely, and they didn't want, this is the British military. If we can get a cheap, if they want a cheap gun, we'll give them a cheap gun. For the few that want a rifle, yeah, but it takes so much longer to load them. The Brown Bess, the military, they could load and reload, I think, 3 or 4 times in a minute. Whereas with a rifle, you would be lucky you'd already been shot 2 times by the time you got yours loaded. Just they took that much longer to load for the for the want of accuracy. So. And speaking of the Chief's guns had distinguishing features such as the image of a native warrior on the top of the wrist portion of the stock in the form of a thumb plate. So if you were to pick up one of them muskets and you held it, the trigger's here, your thumb is sitting on that plate with that bust on it. And they had brass hardware at the trigger guard, the side and the butt plates, and they were also nicely engraved on the lock, trigger guard, side plate, and the butt plate. And they consisted of engravings of bows and arrows, a boar's head within a round horn or a French horn, and the Chief's guns were often equipped with a rifle barrel. Not all the time, but sometimes, because the Chief's gun, they didn't take them into battle because they were too nice to have them at home. And these are a couple of shots of the brass side plate on the Chief's gun, and you can see the bow and you can see the arrow through it, and some more engraving in the center. You can see it's got some nice line work on the outer edge. Even the machine head, the screws have got engraving on them instead of just a plain head. So yeah, they were a nicer gun for sure. And here we see again a picture of the butt plate and the lock, and it's hard to make out, but there is a boar's head coming out of that round horn. And you see the brass plate, the brass butt plate. It's nicely shaped. It's got line engraving around the outside of the border. It's a nicer gun. On the lock, you can see the boar's head a little clearer coming out of the center of that round horn. The trigger guard, brass, and it's got the same engraving of a bow and arrow underneath it. And again, it's got some nice shape and style to it with a line engraving. On the lock itself, I don't know if you can see it, we've got the manufacturer's name, and you can just make out, there's a better picture coming, of the Board of Ordnance stamp, which again was unique because these weren't intended for civilians. They were giving these to the indigenous warriors, so they wanted them marked so that they knew if they ended up in somebody's fur trade house that they didn't get them legally. But anyway, that Board of Ordnance stamp is the broad arrow, and for some reason on the locks, they took the crown, the British crown, and stamped it standing vertically, and you'll see it on an upcoming picture. Why they did that, I don't know. But. And now we get to the common guns. Well, the common guns, just as the name implies, they used a large steel trigger guard, unlike the Chief's gun, but they carry the same proof marks and the stamps as found on both firearms. The side plate of a common gun was a brass serpent, which had become the favorite amongst the indigenous people and was found on the same firearms supplied by the fur trade companies. The butt plate was a plain brass and unengraved. Fur companies refer to these guns as Northwest trade guns. And again, the brass serpent side plate, a lot of people feel that it connected with a lot of indigenous people in the Great Lakes areas. They feel that it was symbolic of one of their cultural stories of the underwater panther, Mishu Pishu. If you've ever been up into the Sioux area at Lake Superior Park or Batchewana Bay, there's the pictographs on the rocks, and there's a picture of this underwater panther painted in red ochre, and a canoe with people in it as well. So some people feel that the indigenous people saw that serpent side plate, they recognized it from their cultural beliefs, and they automatically took a liking to it. So again, if that's what they want on their guns, if that's what they like, yeah, that's no problem, put that on. So that particular gun with that serpent side plate, it came into favor right around the time of the Revolutionary War, and this style of gun in different formats, so it changes the barrel slightly, but the serpent side plate, it lasted until well into the late 19th century. Those poor fellows at Batoche, them Métis, they were using, some of those fellows were using that same style of gun. There were no bullets left, no lead shot, they were putting stones down and nails down the barrel shooting at the British, but that's the same type of, they were up against fellas that were using British Enfields, so they were really outmatched. And these are a couple photos of some originals from the Fort York collection. And that top gun is actually a Ketlin Walker, so it was one of the ones that was the company that produced the most during the war. And you can see the oversized trigger guard. They say that trigger guard is that size because the indigenous people found it too awkward to have to take their mitt off to shoot during winter hunting. So if the trigger guard made bigger, they could leave their mitt on and still pull the trigger. So it's unique to these Northwest style trade guns or common guns. And of course, when you see a pistol below and a powder horn. Now the common guns, because they were just that, they were identical to the guns that the fur trade companies were giving out. The British didn't want them to fall into the wrong hands. You're sending over 30,000 guns, pretty easy for a few cases to go missing and end up in Joe Smith's trading post, right? So the Indian Department branded those common guns, not the Chief's guns, because they were so unique, you could tell them a mile away. But the common gun was just the very same gun as what the fur companies had. So the Indian Department branded their guns in the stock, usually on the butt and just forward of the lock. And they branded them deep, so that if you tried to file that brand out, you would have to go so deep that you could tell, why this brand new gun's only got these two great big chunks sanded out. They could tell that that was a stolen gun and shouldn't be in your trade shop. And these are just a few shots of the replicas back there. If you don't get a chance to take a look, you can see the brand of the Indian Department, the locks, and so on. Again, very little decorating, not too, I get asked all the time, didn't the indigenous people decorate all their weapons? And, well, yeah, I suppose some did, yeah. But well, how come we don't have any examples from 1812? Well, in this area, it was a custom when a warrior passed away that he was buried with all his tools and his weapons. So any guns that made them around her were buried with that particular person. So there's very few examples of anything that we see that was personally decorated during this time period. And again, just another shot, you can see the serpent side plate a little clearer, and again, on your way out, just take a look at the guns back there, you get a much better idea of what we're looking at. Again, just a plain gun, they're around 7 pounds, round barrel, one front sight, no rear sight, just plain and simple, did the job. This is a better shot of the markings on the lock. You'll see the manufacturer's name, Whately, and that is what they call a fox sitting within a circle, and that's the mark of the British broad arrow. And if you look closely, you can picture the crown, but it's vertically instead of horizontally. They got it vertically, so the two join together. It looks like one big arrowhead. And for those that don't understand what I'm talking about when I call it the lock of the gun, it's the firing mechanism of the gun. So what they would do is there'd be a piece of flint put in those jaws of the hammer. They would put gunpowder in the pan, and there's a hole that was drilled into the gun barrel. And of course, this was called a frizzen. They would flip it down to make sure the gunpowder didn't fall out. And they would cock the gun, half cock, again put gunpowder down the barrel end, stamp it down with a ramrod with a lead ball, and then of course pull the trigger. The flint would hit the frizzen as the frizzen was popping up. The flint is harder than some of the metal they use, so it would scrape metal off, creating sparks. The sparks would ignite the gunpowder in the pan, which would burn over through that hole into the barrel, cause the gunpowder in the barrel to explode, forcing the ball out the other way. It took me about 25 seconds to say it, and about half a second for it to actually happen once you pulled the trigger. But that's exactly the principle of how it worked. And again, you can see it on those examples back there. And that particular gun is the top gun I have in that back corner that I've put some patina on. And this is just a typical bill of lading. So this is a bill that would have been with the ship's manifests going from Europe over to Canada, and we can see that we've got 10 cases of Chiefs guns and 11 cases of common guns, and of course 12 casks of tobacco. You got whatever tool you have got to have tobacco to go with it. And anyway, it's bound. It's coming from Kingston. It's bound for Fort George, and going to be forwarded to Fort Malden at Amherstburg. So it's quite a. These things travel a long distance to not travel too much further once they got to where they're supposed to be. And again, just a recap of the different stampings and marks. The Board of Ordnance had big capital B, capital O with the broad arrow in between, and the Indian Department would stamp their items with the capital I with the D and the broad arrow in between. And at war's end, things returned to normal, or as normal as could be, I guess, for a lot of people. And in this piece of artwork, we see a group of Hurons just leaving the Amherstburg area, going on a hunting excursion. And again, we can see all the gentlemen have got a musket with them. The first fellow has got his tied to the pack behind him. Second fellow's got his over his shoulder, and the third fellow just has his laying across his lap on his horse. And that's how
You're doing pretty good on time. Should be wrapping up soon.
Yeah, for sure.
8:15 in case you were wondering.
Okay, I just want to leave you with a couple interesting little notes of trivia in regards to, we've talked about tomahawks and hatchets. The English refer to them as tomahawks because that's what the first term they heard, the Pilgrims and those fellows on the east coast of the States heard. The French call them hatchets. They're more or less one and the same. So when you hear them, like Isaac Weld, if you noticed in his little quote there, he says the common tomahawk or the tomahawk is nothing but a common hatchet. Well, it's the same thing. He's using the English term, and then he uses the French term, but generally speaking, they're one and the same. And a lot of things we get from history are some real great phrases and sayings that just seem to make the sense that they never go away. And one of them, of course, is when people or countries resolve differences or arguments or wars, they say they've buried the hatchet. Let's bury the hatchet. Well, that term comes from, in this area, the Haudenosaunee people. Their history tells us that before contact, the Six Nations, or the Haudenosaunee nations, fought against each other all the time. They're the same linguistic group, but they just fought, and it was detrimental to them. The two fellows came along, Hiawatha and the Peacemaker, and those two fellows convinced them to stop fighting. Your children have no future. You're just constantly bickering against each other. So he finally convinced all of the Haudenosaunee nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca, to finally, agree to stop this nonsense. And when they all agreed to, their history tells us that the Peacemaker gathered them all together and he uprooted the great pine tree, and he told them to cast all your weapons of war into that hole. And they literally burying all your weapons of war, never to use them against each other again. And then he replanted the great tree, the pine tree, the great tree of peace. And from that time on, they, for the most part, stopped fighting amongst themselves. When it comes to muskets, now we've all heard people that have had some devastating things happen to them. Their houses have burnt down, they just got out with the clothes they're wearing. Businesses that have gone bankrupt and so on. We say they lost it all, lock, stock, and barrel. Well, when you were on the frontier and you had your musket consisted of a lock, a stock, and a barrel. That's how you made your living if you were involved in the fur trade. That's how you provided food for yourself and your family. That's how you protected yourself. So if your lock broke, you could get it fixed. If your barrel broke, you could get another one. If your stock broke, you could mend it and still use your gun until you got it fixed. But if you're in your little canoe with all your life's possessions with you, and you're paddling across Lake Ontario heading to York with all your furs for the season, and you tipped your canoe over, and your musket went to the bottom of the lake, until you got it replaced, you literally had lost everything. The lock, the stock, and the barrel. And that's just a few little things I find to be cute and interesting, and that's all I got to say for tonight. Thanks very much.